record now. It should be happening. And then I will open the session formally. So I said, my name is Mark Winfield. I'm co-chair of the Sustainable Energy Initiative, and I'm going to be chairing today's session. I want to begin by also thanking Joanne Whitmore, who is the research associate with the chair at SEI, who was instrumental in organizing this. And it's very clear that we've clearly touched on a topic around which there is very strong interest. Our original intention was that this session was originally intended for an audience for the Quebec, outside of Quebec, but clearly we've also found audiences inside Quebec as well. Given that original intention, we will proceed en anglais, and we will work from there, although we will also, there is a transcript as well for those to whom that would be helpful, if you want to enable that. As we begin formally, as with all events hosted by York University, we begin with a land acknowledgement. And in this case, also recognizing that we have an audience which is spread over at least, I've seen at least 3 provinces. So I do invite people. This acknowledgement will be for those of us who are in Toronto, Takaranto, and Southern Ontario, but invite others to reflect on the history of colonization and settlement of the locations that they are occupying now as well. And these are themes also which will come up in our conversations around the relationship with Indigenous peoples and energy resource development. York University recognizes that many First Nations Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territories upon which the university's campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university, in some cases by tens of thousands of years. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. No, not English. Save. Sorry. Many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. Is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and we also note that the territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Thank you. Merci, Meglich. Today, we are a large group. Larger than we'd expected, actually, but that's fine. We will be proceeding in this Zoom meeting format. We did look into changing this over to webinar. That turned out to be more technically complicated than it seemed to be worth. So I just have to ask people to mute, keep their microphones muted unless you're speaking. We also will ask people to hold any questions until the end. We'll hear from our 3 speakers first, and then ask everybody to hold any questions until they've had a chance to make their opening remarks. Once we're into the question and answer phase, you can use the raise hand function within Zoom, and that gives us an order in which people have raised their hands. My student, JJ Strantz, who's a student in the MES JD program at York University, will also be monitoring the chat. And so we will be looking for any questions, themes that are coming up there that we may want to put to the panel as well. So questions effectively can go into the chat as well as raising your hand and asking questions. As I mentioned, we are recording the session as we usually do with these events, and we will post the recording or link to the recording on the Sustainable Energy Initiative and HSA chair websites. As soon as that's prepared, there'll be some production that goes on with our communication staff around that. So to open, the reason we've come together here is that in June of this year, the Government of Quebec tabled Bill 69, which is intended to advance Quebec's energy transition and carbon neutrality objectives by the middle of the century. And the bill is seen in some quarters as the most significant energy legislation in Quebec in a generation. It introduces the concept of integrated energy resource management planning and lays the groundwork for a restructuring of the roles of Hydro-Québec, the Régie d'Énergie, and the private sector. The landscape around this, which was already reflecting a fairly high degree of ambition and potentially very large investments in new generating capacity in Quebec, a figure of $185 billion has been talked about. The landscape is also complicated at this stage by the departure of the Minister Fitzgibbon, who was the original sponsor of the bill, but also raises a series of wider questions about the future direction of energy, electricity, and climate change policy in Quebec. And in that context, in talking to Joanne about this, we asked who could we bring together to help to inform this conversation, and as it has turned out, both inside and outside of Quebec. And in doing so, we were very fortunate to get the agreement of Pierre-Olivier Pinault, who is professor and director of the chair in energy sector management at HEC Montreal, who will give some context and a summary of the legislation. Cynthia Morinville, who is a professor at the Department of Environmental Sciences, Université de Québec at Trois-Rivières, who will be discussing the social acceptability and implications of the bill, particularly for First Nations. And I was very happy to learn that Cynthia had actually been a postdoctoral fellow at York University. So there's connections all over the place. And then Louis-Nicolas Boulanger, who's a partner in the business law group at McCarthy Tétrault, will speak about the implications of the bill for the private sector, both producers and consumers of energy. So I'm going to begin by handing over to Pierre-Olivier to begin, and then we'll hear from Cynthia, and then Louis-Nicolas. So Pierre-Olivier, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark, for giving me the floor. I'll share my screen because I've prepared a few slides and it's coming up. Sorry, we always have issues. Okay, here it is. So I'll give some general introduction on Quebec's power sector, the energy transition, and then Bill 69. And then I'll start from a very general pan-Canadian quick overview of electricity production, just to show that Quebec is actually a distinct society in electricity, because you can see by these numbers, these are the electricity generation number in 2023 by province, and you can see that despite not being the largest province, Quebec has the largest generation of all provinces, and it's highly dominated by hydro that you see in blue in the middle of the screen. And we also have an increasing amount of wind generation, or around 10 terawatt hour, which is slightly less than Ontario and about the same as Alberta. And then that generation, which is huge, gives Quebec, of course, a very large advantage in terms of prices, because that hydro is produced at a very low cost, at very low cost. So when we look at prices and then consumption levels, this is the kind of picture we can make of the 10 provinces. So you can see the Quebec bubble on the left, at the top left, where you see the per capita electricity consumption again in 2003. So Quebec has the highest per capita electricity consumption and the lowest residential prices. So, and these electricity consumption per capita, they're bundling all consumption, industrial, commercial, and residential. So it's not a reflection on an individual consumption, but it's just the per capita total electricity consumption. And we can clearly see a trend where the higher the prices, of course, usually the lower the consumption. And so partly prices are giving some advantage in Quebec to have relatively low prices compared, for example, to Ontario or Alberta, where you see much larger prices. Ontario would be close to 15 cents. Alberta residential prices in 2023 increased a lot. So you see them beyond 25 cents, but they can fluctuate in Alberta depending on the year and the situation. But this gives an overview of the landscape. But why I insist on comparing with other provinces is just to basically emphasize the fact that Quebec is in a very good position with low prices, already green, large. And what we don't see on this picture is also have a lot of storage, which may be, well, not may, but is actually key in integrating additional wind and solar, is that hydro dams in Quebec have extremely large storage capacity of water. And that is, of course, an asset when you want to integrate additional wind. So we're already in a good position, but it could even be more interesting, the Quebec position, given the storage capacity that exists, that is counted in terawatt hours of storage, when usually we install megawatt hours of storage in batteries or different types of storage. How again the sector is structured, the power sector is restructured about Hydro-Québec, which is an integrated company where generation, transmission, and distribution are bundled into one single company. And it's even more bundled since a few years, because before Hydro-Québec did have three different units: generation, transmission, and distribution. But these units have disappeared, and there's a new policy to have one hydro, which means that Hydro-Québec is now one single entity with different units that I still have a hard time understanding, because they have names that are too long and not obvious to understand. But they, of course, deal with different aspects of the energy, the power sector. Hydro-Québec is owned by the government. It's and relates to the Ministry of Economy, Innovation, and Energy. There's a Quebec Energy Board called La Régie de l'Énergie that regulates transmission and distribution. And there are other aspects, in the sense that while Quebec is part of a Northeast grid and of North America, and there are reliability regulation that come from supranational body, the NERC, the North American Electricity Reliability Corporation. And so that provides some kind of regulation on some technical aspects for transmission. And then, of course, besides Hydro-Québec, because Hydro-Québec, while being extremely large, is not the only producer. There are actually many independent power producers producing wind, biomass, small hydro. Most of them have long-term contracts with Hydro-Québec, but some of them export to the US or other provinces. And then we have industrial self-consumers, mostly aluminum companies, but also some pulp and paper companies that mostly have their own hydro. And that's in a few hundred megawatt of capacity. I think it's around 2,000 megawatt as a total. So that's for the power sector. And besides that, of course, there is all the carbon policy and the climate change policy, which is in the hands of the Environment Ministry, the Ministry of the Environment and the fight against climate change and parks, which basically has a green economy plan, the Plan pour une économie verte, which is the overall policy to fight climate change, but probably the more formal tool to actually put an explicit constraint on emission is the carbon market, that generates a lot of that is placing a cap on emissions in junction with California, and is generating a lot of money, around $9 billion since beginning in 2013. And that money is going into the electrification fund that actually provides subsidies for the different efficiency programs and EV subsidies and other programs that you see listed below. And that's so there is currently a slight disconnect between the climate policy and the energy policy, because in the energy policy so far, and that's something that the Bill 69 will try to change, is that Régie de l'Énergie and Hydro-Québec don't have any kind of official mandate to do the energy transition or to help decarbonization. It is not part of their historical mandate, and that is something that Bill 69 is trying to change, to place into the mission of Régie de l'Énergie and Hydro-Québec the goal of doing the energy transition. While, however, there is no specific goals in terms of decarbonization, it has energy transition within the law, and as long as energy transition is decarbonization, well, the two should better go hand in hand. A key constraint on the energy sector in Quebec is the carbon caps that we have, the carbon emission caps that you see on that graph. So that graph has a lot of material on it. On the top of it, you see total greenhouse gas emissions in Quebec, not going down very quickly, and maybe we, it's still above the target. So you see targets. You see targets actually the same color as free allocation, with free allocation at the bottom, targets are at the top. For the 2020 target was 68 million tons of greenhouse gases emissions, which corresponds to a decrease in 20% from the 1990 level. Emissions in Quebec have not reached a target, but if we count, which is not shown on the picture, the net trade of emission rights with California, and we count that net trade as emission reductions in Quebec, then basically we would have met the minus 20% emission reduction by counting the net trade of emission rights with California, which is officially and legally the way we are measuring our target. Nevertheless, we see that for 2030 we have a target of 53 million ton, which is 37% below the 1990 emission level. And as you can see, we're not really on track to meet that, whereas the carbon cap, which are the black lines that you see decreasing every year, these are the emission caps that are going down. So there is a real constraint in terms of emission cap, and there's a price of carbon that is increasing, although now it is lower than the actual federal price, and that's of course an area of concerns for many Canadians to see the federal carbon price being higher than the Quebec carbon price. But as you can see, the Quebec carbon price is rising, and there are chances that it actually rises to a level that could meet the same carbon price as we have in Canada, especially since this year the Quebec government is also planning to optimize its carbon market and probably reduce the amount of emission rights available. There are a lot of quantified objectives in the green plan for 2030. So the course here is not to go through all these objectives, but just to show you that there's no shortage of objectives and no shortage. These are all policy objectives coming directly from the website of the Quebec government. We have so many objectives that it's hard to actually keep track of all of them, but we have plentiful of objective. But more concretely, Hydro-Québec has more explicit objective and concrete objectives in terms of its plan to decarbonize or help decarbonize the Quebec economy by electrifying and producing more energy. So the idea is by 2035 to have 60 terawatt hour of additional available energy for consumers. 40 terawatt hours should come from new generation projects, and 20 terawatt hours should come from energy efficiency. And then you see the goal by 2050 is to actually increase by a significant amount, which would most likely double the current generation level in Quebec, which is around 200 terawatt hour. So Quebec is is planning to actually radically change its electricity sector by possibly doubling the size of Hydro-Québec or the power sector in Quebec. In order to help achieve that, Bill 69 is making some changes. Probably the biggest change that most almost everyone, I think everyone agrees is important, is the integrated resource plan, which would be a long-term 25 years resource plan led by the government with Hydro-Québec and Énergie with public consultations, although we don't know exactly what form that plan will have. But the idea is to look at the requirements for Quebec to reach the 2050 goal and try to organize the sector and lay out the ground for investment, not only in the power sector, but also in biogas and biofuels, and also to more explicitly plan the role of hydrocarbons in the transition, because there will still be hydrocarbons at least for a few decades. The bill also talks about electricity rates. They would be set every 3 years. There would be a cap of 3% for residential consumers, and the missing money from the actual rate increase that would have to come because there are lots of investment by Hydro-Québec that are planned, and probably the investment would justify a higher rate increase than 3%. So the missing money for Hydro-Québec would come from a new fund to compensate Hydro-Québec, and then that new fund would come from the government and taxpayers to help residential consumers not pay the actual cost of the new investment. As I mentioned, energy transition would also be part of the mission of Hydro-Québec and La Régie de l'Énergie, and that would basically help them create actions that are more aligned with the overall energy transition. There are some changes in the board, in the number of board members for Hydro-Québec, and possibly less regulators at La Régie de l'Énergie. So that's a change in law that could actually decrease the oversight, the independent oversight that would happen in these sectors. A significant part that Louis-Nicolas will talk more about is the capacity Hydro-Québec will have to develop projects. Call for tenders are actually removed as an obligation, so to let Hydro-Québec go faster in developing projects, and these projects wouldn't be selected on their merits by independent call for tender. They would be selected by Hydro-Québec and approved by La Régie de l'Énergie, and so that approval would be the external oversight that would exist on Hydro-Québec's project. And IPP would be given a right to sell their electricity to direct neighbors, so that could also free up some space for some additional space for independent power producer. So implications, and that is my last slide. Possibly better energy planning, but there's still ambiguity who will pay for everything, all the investment. We'll have a bigger and more powerful Hydro-Québec. And then for our neighbors, it is really a self-centered decarbonization process with, to some extent, a demonization of power exports and trade, because really we want to, the idea is to try to keep the electricity in Quebec for industries need. So there is, to some extent, the idea of a Quebec-centered decarbonization. Thank you very much. I'll stop here and give the floor to my colleagues.
Merci, Pierre-Olivier. We will hear next from Cynthia.
Thank you, Marc. Thank you, Pierre-Olivier, as well, for this introduction. I'm just going to try and go ahead and share my slides here. Okay, I trust you guys can see the slides, Marc?
Yes. Great,
awesome. All right, so good morning, everybody. I'd like to begin by situating myself in the context of this panel. So I'm an ethnographer by training and a professor of human geography, as Marc said in the opening, and I also hold the Canada Research Chair in the political economy of the energy transition. And so my work is interested in the socioeconomic and environmental impacts of energy transition projects for frontline communities specifically. And so today I'll be drawing on this work to make 3 key points about the possible implication of PL 69 on the social front, broadly speaking. But I will not be getting into the nitty-gritty details of the bill, and Pierre-Olivier has already done a tremendous introduction for this. So I'll speak rather to the political and policy context with which the bill as an overarching legal framework is aligned. And so to begin with, the project le projet de loi 69, is proposing a plan to green the energy sector by adding significant capacity in renewable energy. The bill and the project, that is the energy transition more broadly, however, as Pierre-Olivier just alluded to, is suspiciously silent on how we're going to phase out non-renewable energy in this province. And so with clear industrial development intentions and the suddenly anticipated energy deficit, the key word here is adding rather than substituting energy sources that is required, however, to achieve any energy transition, a point that has been made by several commentators in the past few months. And so the association between decarbonization objectives and industrial development objectives are not unique to Quebec. And in this province, they're certainly not new. The first Plan Directeur for the energy transition, which was signed at the time by Premier Philippe Couillard, presented the energy transition from the very beginning here in Quebec as a good business opportunity in the very first pages of the document. But while the bill is proposing, at least in part, an industrial development plan, the government is on the other end asking Quebecois to care about, to change their behavior, and to drastically reduce their consumption of energy, while simultaneously massively increasing production and offering it for industrial development. And I'm foregrounding this contextual background because, in my opinion, it creates a context in which the population sees the fault lines and the lack of coherence therein in the management of the energy sector at this time. And this has massive implication, not only for government approval ratings at the moment, but also for the buy-in that would be necessary if we ever are to deploy any substantial energy transition. We'll need people on board for an energy transition, and the current energy development plan proposed by the government and written into PL 69 does not get us any closer to getting this onboarding from the population, I would say. And so there's a certain cynicism that's currently permeating the population at the moment, and the reverberation of this on the construction and the deployment of a battery sector is only compounded, by slowdowns in the EV markets at the moment and the reverberation that this is having on the construction and deployment of a battery sector in Bécancour and McMasterville, as well as Mark mentioned at the beginning of the webinar as the recent premature departure of Pierre Fitzgibbon, and as well as the recent comments that were made by Michael Sabia during last week's hearing on this bill. So this context, to me, is creating I would call this cynicism, but a context in which people are not buying into this energy transition. And it's creating a context that is that is not favorable, or that is falling short of the momentum that would be necessary for a social transformation of the scale that is needed for an energy transition at the moment. And so there's a need on the one hand to differentiate and address decarbonization objectives independently of industrial development, and PL 69 not only fails to do that, but in fact reasserts their connection. And so this is a high-level comment on general social acceptability that would be needed in this province. But beyond this necessary large-scale social and acceptability and the onboarding that will be necessary for an energy transition, PL 69 also fails, in my opinion, to address the tensions between an approach towards energy sobriety, degrowth, reduction in consumption and needs on the one hand, and increased capacity and mass deployment on renewable on the other hand. And this tension lies at the heart of the energy transition debate in this province. And so in doing so, it leaves out this debate because it fails to address it in the current proposed bill. And with no place to go, this debate will likely be devolved onto local communities, which will be the front lines of a fight between these two drastically opposed visions to an energy transition. And we have started to see some of these debates play out in some rather small communities with obvious implication for social cohesion and the social fabric of these local environments. And so, of course, while energy development is likely not to proceed as it has historically without local consent, and with this desire and promise that has been announced from the Premier, from Hydro-Québec, to rightfully involve communities, there's also an obvious risk that social acceptability could be monetized in these contexts. And so, while social acceptability is rapidly becoming a criterion paramount to any development project, it remains to be defined and operationalized, more importantly. And this will have obvious consequences for social cohesion within communities, as well, as I have said, and that be First Nations or Inuit communities, as well as non-Indigenous communities in this province. And so Impacts at times can also reverberate onto local democracy. And to name only a few examples, here in Centre du Québec, a region that had been identified by the first round of calls that went out for wind development about a year or two ago, we have situations here where whenever wind development is being discussed at municipal council or within political instances, a majority of the municipal councillors must recuse themselves because they're also agricultures and farmers, and they have signed agreements with the potential developers in the area. So whenever this topic comes onto the floor for debates, they have to leave the room. And in one particular community that includes the mayor, and so in these situations, without quorum, the entire council cannot operate. And so we've also recently heard here in Mauricie, or in the of a situation in which no talks of wind turbines is currently accepted at city council. The mayor has put a lid on this conversation because it is so divisive in the community, and it gets in the way of the regular proceedings or the regular business that must be accomplished at city council. Those dynamics and those tensions can also play at the supra-municipal level or at the MRC level. In Centre du Québec, again, there's those two opposed visions, one that would propose a decarbonization and a degrowth perspective, and the other one that would rather propose an increase in capacity, or have taken hold in the region of different municipal administration and different councils. And this conflict is making it really hard for the governments of particularly regional portfolios, because the two local municipalities cannot agree with one another, and the tension is permeating other levels of government and other portfolios at this time. And so I want to emphasize, though, that this is not only an issue circumscribed to this region here, or to Centre du Québec specifically, or the province of Quebec. And we only need to look at Muskrat Falls or recent debates around energy development in British Columbia to see how generalized these local expressions of a profound social questions may become. And so by sidestepping this conversation altogether, PL 69 not only misses the opportunity to make space for a crucial social debate, but likely will have significant impact in communities for the next few years. And this brings me to my last point here today. And I want to talk about the environmental impacts of renewable energy projects in this province. And PL 69 and Hydro-Quebec's planned capacity expansion more generally will have a tremendous territorial impact. As I mentioned in the opening, I'm an ethnographer, and right now I'm coming to you from Trois-Rivières, Quebec, which is the heart of the so-called Vallée de la Transition énergétique, or the Energy Transition Valley, which is home to the entire lithium battery sector, with the exception of Nordvolt only. And so what I want to emphasize here is that a deployment of this sort will have obvious impacts on the local ecosystems. And so I want to emphasize how frontline communities will also bear the brunt, not only socially of this debate, but also environmentally speaking, they will bear the brunt or the cost of this energy transition. And that is not to say that we should move forward with the energy transition, but it is a conversation that we need to have. And there are deep contradictions, therefore, between the environmental values that motivate most discussion of the energy transitions, which are often held at the national, provincial, or even international level, and the ways in which that transition will anchor itself in the land and territory, and the lived experience, therefore, of that energy transition for community members. And so locally, the energy transition will not, or rarely, be green, if I can put it so bluntly. And so for communities that will be welcoming of or will be hosting these energy transition projects, the impact on their environments will rather be industrial. And that debate has not permeated the debate, I personally think. And so while communities want to do their parts, they want to play a part in the energy transition. This is what we hear on the ground. People are aware of the climate crisis. They bear the brunt of it. They see the climate changing. They see the summer floods coming more regularly. So people want to be involved, but they have important questions about how we're going to do this, and for whose benefits, and also at the expense of which community. Because for their their own lived experience of this energy transition, the impacts might not necessarily be net positive from an environmental point of view. And so these were the 3 key points I wanted to make here today. And I think I'll leave it at that, Mark, and take questions if those come up in the Q&A. And so over to you, Louis-Nicolas.
Merci, Cynthia. This is very interesting. I'll just comment very briefly because there are also some very interesting parallels with Ontario around the social conflicts around, for example, wind development and the Green Energy Act and the degree to which that was imposed very top down. So we'll come back to that, I think, in the Q&A, and we want to hand over to Louis-Nicolas for now, who will be talking about the impacts of the legislation on the private sector.
Merci, Marc. Merci, Cynthia. Thank you, Pierre-Olivier. Let me try to share my screen first, which should be working now. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. I'll just adjust this and get going. So, good morning, everyone.
It may be still in sort of note mode as opposed to presentation mode.
Okay.
Which is fine if we can't.
I don't know, it seems like it's presenting for me.
Okay.
Let me just try one last thing, and if not, I'll just go with that. Reshare this. And we'll do this. Okay, so that's probably the best my limited technical capabilities can do. All right.
C'est bien, merci.
All right. So good morning, everyone. So as Mark introduced me a bit briefly at the beginning of this session, I'm a partner in the law firm called McCarty Tetro in Montreal, meaning that I basically do acquisition transactions, M&A, as we say in our field, joint venture, other commercial transactions, but I do have a special focus on the renewable energy sector, of course, here in Quebec. So I basically represent various stakeholders involved in the energy industry, including independent power producers, who will be one of the key focus of my discussion this morning. So I'm very grateful to have been invited today by Professor Winfield at the University of York and HEC to have this opportunity to share my perspective on the impacts of Bill 69 on the private sector. We are at a very exciting time in the energy sector worldwide, but particularly in Quebec. So it's always great to have an opportunity to exchange on this topic. So for the private sector on the production side, we're starting from the early 2000s. And if we recall, for those who were focusing on the market in those days, the early 2000s were marked by significant wind call for tenders that were mostly designed by the government as an economic development tool to economically support certain regions such as Gaspésie and Bas-Saint-Laurent. So this is why in those days you could see requirements in the 3,000 megawatt plus of call for tenders that we had to, for example, use wind turbines that were manufactured in the region as a means or an attempt to create a whole new industry or supply chain to support local communities, or other requirements, for example, to grant equity in wind projects to municipalities or First Nations. Fast forward from those years by about 10 to 15 years, and we're in a situation of overcapacity where the province essentially suspends new private procurements and vigorously attempt with success to offload electricity with deals with our US neighbors to the south. Now, another fast forward by about 5 years, and here we are today in a completely different context of power shortages and faced with huge challenges of successfully achieving Quebec's energy transition objectives. So this leads us, or this is really the context within which Bill 69 is being presented by the government, really an attempt to modernize our energy regulation framework. And this bill does raise interesting questions and considerations for the private sector, both within its role as an energy producer, but also as an energy consumer. So first, I'll make a few comments, and the first few slides are about the private sector, but from a production side. and I'll finish by talking about the consumer side. So I'll just try to switch my slide. So basically, the first change that I would like to bring to your attention is an obvious one, but I think it's a very important one. It's how the bill attempts to change or modify the rules concerning Hydro-Québec's monopoly. So in Quebec, Pierre-Olivier did allude to this a bit, but basically in Quebec, the current framework is that Hydro-Québec holds the exclusive distribution rights on the province, basically meaning you cannot sell electricity unless you're Hydro-Québec. There are some limited exceptions to this. Of course, self-production is currently permitted, and some various very specific grandfathered private networks also have this right. I have reproduced on the screen a translation of what the Bill 69 proposes to change. I won't read this. I don't think you need to focus on it, because what I would like you to retain is that basically the bill will preserve the ability to self-produce. So that's a given. That's not going to change. It's abolishing these private networks that I just referred to, but probably this is a mistake, and I would fully expect Hydro-Québec, not Hydro-Québec, but the government to reintroduce this when a further version of the bill is presented after the debates that are currently taking place. But the key change is the opening of the possibility of a sale of electricity generated by a renewable source to an adjacent site, subject again to governmental authorization. So basically, what we're talking about here is the opening of corporate PPAs, I'll say. So the ability to sell electricity to your neighbor for an industrial site, if it makes sense, and to the extent that the government authorizes it. Now, as reported in the media, I'm not sure if everyone has been following, but some people, and I'll say probably for political reasons, have equated this as a change to the even a partial privatization of Hydro-Québec, because we're essentially touching Hydro-Québec's sacrosanct monopoly to distribute electricity in the province. I do believe it's a misconception, and from my perspective, I think it's a common sense measure which supports Hydro-Québec and the ambitious goals that it has. If it makes sense for a generating producer on its site to supply its neighbor from renewable sources on an adjacent site, the government approves it, instead of asking Hydro-Québec to interconnect and invest massive amounts of money to make that happen, I think it's a common sense measure which again remains subject to the government's authorization. Right or wrong, the government of Quebec has decided to leverage our province's green and relatively cheap power as a tool for economic development. And in that context, Hydro-Québec has adopted a very, very ambitious plan for 2035. Pierre-Olivier did talk about it. We're talking about close to 10,000 megawatt of new additional capacity, which will need to be installed in the province, $155 to $185 billion of investment, both in production and transmission capacity, which is massive. So to me, measures like this one, which solely support and help Hydro-Québec achieving its objective, do make sense. Now, one thing that Bill 69 does not address, and maybe it's going to be addressed in the bill itself or further legislative change, are needed changes to the legal framework governing the allocation of public land, both for self-production and also for private projects, because right now it's fairly controlled in the sense that it's mostly dedicated for RFPs and stuff like that. And I thought also something that will need to be addressed is how agricultural land protection orientations will be dealt with and in conjunction with the government's objective for production of renewable energy. So right now, the Bill 69 does not address this, but for private sector, it's going to be an important piece that's missing right now to make sure that these projects can go forward. Moving on to the next slide, this one is really about the changes to the rules of the award of electricity supply contracts to third parties. Pierre-Olivier did talk about this, but basically, for the private sector, one thing that's interesting is that we're removing the requirement for Hydro-Québec to have its tendering process approved by the Régie de l'Énergie. So basically, Hydro-Québec will now have increased ability to manage its own tendering processes as long as it follows a principle of a fair and impartial treatment of the participants in the process. Same concept applies for the approval by the Régie of new electricity supply contracts. So basically, if Hydro-Québec proceeds with call for tender to the extent that it maintains these principles of fairness and impartial treatment. It can circumvent basically the current regime, which is requires it to go back to the régie for approval, which is a lengthy and process. So it really, at the end of the day, this is meant to allow Hydro-Québec to have more flexibility and be able to move a bit quicker in the pace at which it launches call for tenders. So we see it right now. There's a 300 megawatt solar RFP that's in the books, and that is expected to be launched before the end of the year. But again, the government is not disappearing completely. We're increasing the flexibility, but the government does have the right to compel HQ to issue call for tenders and determine conditions that would be applicable to these RFPs by giving the direction to Hydro-Québec. So for private sector, of course, some interesting opportunities will arise because we're expecting the pace and the frequency of these RFPs to be accelerated. One very quick note on small hydro and the development of hydro production in the province. Basically, the Bill 69 will modify our Water Regime Act in the province, basically allowing private sector to be involved on projects up to 100 megawatt. That was the prior limit was 50 megawatts. And the bill will also grant more flexibility so that by regulation, the rates for royalties and rents can be modulated more by the minister. Basically, I think large hydro development in the province had been conducted by Hydro-Québec. The La Romaine, I'm sure everyone has, most people have heard about the latest, biggest project. So basically, Hydro-Québec was conducted these mega projects, while small hydro up to 50 megawatts was reserved to the private sector. So this will be, and this is an important impact for the private sector, now opening a bit more their ability to develop bigger projects up to 100 megawatt, while still preserving HQ's monopoly on the development of big hydro. Really quickly also, another interesting amendment for the private sector is the changes to the Municipal Powers Act, whereby essentially the bill will aim at granting more flexibility to municipalities and regional county municipalities to invest in bigger projects, essentially. Now, for the private sector, this is not new. In Quebec, we have pioneering municipalities and regional county municipalities who've band or grouped together themselves to drive and control the development of wind projects on the territory. I'm talking about the Alliance de l'Énergie de l'Est, which has now been an important player in the sector since the early 2000s. So basically now this will open up even more the role of municipalities as they partner into projects with the private sector on the production side. And I think my time is running out, and I want to finish by talking about the private sector, but on the consumption side or on the consumer side. And I think this is another important piece of this that's not being discussed, because I'm referring to the changes that were introduced back in 2023. So if you were following the province legislative framework since then, you may have heard that the province has essentially applied in what we called at the time Bill number 2, which was the second bill adopted in February 2023. One major change is to Hydro-Québec's obligation to supply electricity. So the prior regime before that, Hydro-Québec was obligated essentially to supply anyone who requested it, sorry, up to a capacity of 50 megawatts. So there were some exceptions, mostly related to interconnection and whatnot, but the principle was that if you had a load under 50 megawatt, Hydro-Québec had the obligation to supply you. So basically you had tariffs which apply depending on various categories of consumers that applied for up to 50 megawatts. And supplies of more than 50 megawatts were subject to a special contract, which was adopted by the government. So the conditions for delivery of electricity were set up by the government by decree. And that was for the major industrial loads in the province. Now, in 2023, what the government did, reacting essentially to a situation of power shortfalls, decided to essentially impose a limit to 5 megawatts, which is significant, meaning that if I'm sort of oversimplifying now, Hydro-Québec does not have an obligation to supply power for any load other than 5 megawatt unless it obtains approval from the Minister of Economy. Now, we are still in transitional measures, but Bill 69 does reconduct this regime, and the regime is continuing. We're expecting at some point a more detailed regulation, which will sort of provide a more comprehensive framework to understand how this works. But essentially right now, regulation says that the minister can decide if your load is accepted or not based on a few conditions, one of which is Hydro-Québec's technical capabilities, whether it makes sense for Hydro-Québec technically to interconnect a project to its grid. Economic benefits is taken into consideration, as well as social and environmental impacts are also supposed to be taken into consideration by the government, meaning that the government has broad discretion now to decide where they're going to allocate any load, any new megawatts for a load more than 5 megawatt. So Bill 69 does not change this new regime that's been adopted back in 2023. It does create uncertainty for industrial consumers contemplating projects in Quebec, because now there is a bit of a dialogue that needs to happen with the government to discuss power consumption and how the province would be able to meet the needs of an industrial project before a project is actually authorized on the ground. So it does create a bit of uncertainty for the private sector from that perspective. And we'll see if the definitive version of the bill does provide a bit more guidance on that front. So, Mark, with that, I think I will send it back to you for the management of the Q&A section, I guess.
Merci, Louis. Nicola, this is fascinating as well. It sort of, I had a whole bunch of additional questions that sort of flow here as well of a more technical nature. Interesting. We'll come back to effectively the business to business kind of relationships, which could be a form of private microgrid or could be something else. And then also this very interesting question around this sort of, we no longer guarantee you a connection, which is sort of suggesting that's so they can control where the load is going to come from, like who's going to have access to the system, as opposed to, you know, an automatic obligation that if you're setting up, Hydro-Québec is going to serve you. So that's quite an interesting shift in the sense of how it changes where power and control is located. I'll come back on that and thank all three speakers. These were excellent presentations and extremely informative. I've seen a couple of questions in the chat, and I had a couple just off the top as well that maybe I'll start with. And also I'll invite people to use the raise hand function, which will put you in the stack if you want to ask a verbal question. I've got a couple of ones that came up in my mind just as I was listening that I'll maybe start with while we let people formulate their own questions. And these are sort of to all the panel, partially Pierre-Olivier, but others too. In terms of the projected doubling of capacity, I mean, is there a sense of what are the technological choices that are being made there? Like, is this going to be hydro? Is this going to be wind? Is this going to be something else? Do we have any clarity on that at this stage in terms of where we think the additional capacity is going to come from technologically to start with?
But by 2035 in Hydro-Québec's plan, it's clearly dominated by wind. So so it's clearly around 10,000 megawatt of wind and a few additional, probably a few hundred megawatt of solar. There is a mention of adding 2,000 megawatt of hydro, but not new hydro, increasing the capacity of existing hydro and possibly exploring a new hydro site. So it's I would say the answer is the technology is wind with some test on solar, and then Louis Nicolas mentioned a solar call for tender that is coming, and possibly new hydro, although for the new hydro site there are so many things to be to be cleared in terms of potential public acceptability, licenses, etc.
So
and I think just to add on Pierre-Olivier's comment, I wholeheartedly agree. I think that's essentially how it's going to be allocated. And Hydro-Québec will itself conduct a lot of these wind projects. They've essentially indicated that for anything above 1,000 megawatt, which is massive, by the way, there's no 1,000 megawatt wind project in Canada right now. But for anything like that, they will be conducting themselves these projects in partnerships with First Nations and municipality bodies. So they've announced during the summer a partnership in the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region for 3,000 megawatt. So this is the type of thing that they will be doing, while the private sector will still be involved. I mean, some of my clients were worried that they would be completely excluded going forward, but I think they've since then received reassurances that the call for tenders will continue and they will be involved in making sure that that we can meet the province energy needs.
And maybe just
and the other. Oh yeah, well, following the north of Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region, the second region of priority will be the North Coast, in partnership with the Innu communities over there, which has also been in the talks for hydro development as well, but they should be seeing some wind coming their way as well.
And in the longer term, for 2050 additional needs, the idea is that the integrated resource plan would actually look at options and provide a forum of analysis for, nuclear energy has been mentioned, and would new hydro sites really need to be developed? So the forum of discussion and analysis for these long-term potential additions would be the integrated resource plan.
Excellent, thank you. One other question sort of flowed from that, I'm going to go to the floor next, is at least as I understood, how this is going to be paid for in terms of capital investments. Is it that residential consumer rate increases are going to be capped at 3%, and which probably not enough to cover the scale of capital investment being talked about here. And Pierre-Olivier, I think you made some reference to some sort of government fund, but does it have a sense of how is this? I mean, this is a question for Ontario too, where the number on the table is 400 billion. How is that going to work, or do we know at this stage?
Well, Hydro-Québec has put some numbers out in terms of the amount of investment they're planning by 2035, between 140 billion to 185 billion. Now they are going to, we are at the beginning of a rate case now at la Régie de l'Énergie. So Hydro-Québec is asking for some rate increase to pay some of the initial investment they're planning to make, and of course, for all consumer types, it's more than 3%. But then for the residential consumers, although La Régie is asking 3.9%, it would be capped at 3%. And then the government would put some money to compensate Hydro-Québec. So there would be some money coming from the general account to help, to minimize the impact on other consumers. But that, of course, that money coming from the general accounts can only coming from debt or taxes. So, in the end, someone has to pay. So what the government is proposing is not to make consumers pay directly, but consumers would pay indirectly through additional debt or taxes.
This is effectively kind of move you to where Ontario is, where we're taking 7.3 billion out of general revenues every year to basically cover off capital investments in the electricity system to keep apparent rates down.
Yes.
Okay, well, it may not be the best model of policy export, but we'll see. We'll see how we're doing. I'm going to go to the floor, and then we've got a couple of things coming up in the chat I see as well. Sébastien Debia, do you want to unmute?
Yeah. Hello, bonjour. I have a question about the implication of Bill 69 and the independence of the regulator. Like we saw in the preamble of the law, there is this sentence that says that the regulator must take into account the priorities of the government in terms of economics, social, and environmental. So it seems like is the government setting the rule now?
I guess the addition would be to make the energy transition part of the more explicitly part of the role of the Régie de l'énergie, to give the Régie de l'énergie some additional power to accept projects that may not be the most cheapest or most economic project, but could be developed because of the energy transition. So in terms of the independence, I mean, the government still has the possibility to mandate and issue some decree to make some projects happen. The government in the past has used its power to create decrees to create some specific rates for some specific groups or some specific call for tenders for some specific technologies. I don't see myself the situation to be worsened, but I don't think the independence of the regime is increasing there. It's probably the same as before, with possibilities from the government to intervene through decrees or some types of regulation, but the Régie de l'énergie would still remain independent. My concern is the possible fewer numbers of actual régisseurs at la régie, so board members, because as there might be, there's the need to approve things and projects will become more complex. If you reduce the number of board members, then maybe you reduce the capacity to of the régie to analyze projects.
Thank you.
This is an interesting set of questions. I've been involved in a research project which is looking at the mandates of all the energy regulators across the country. And one of the things that emerged very quickly is that none of them actually think they have a mandate to involve themselves in energy system transitions or decarbonization, which was quite surprising. There's been a little rumbling in some places, but this new set of questions about they clearly don't feel they can move on this without an explicit mandate, and for the most part they don't have those kinds of mandates around these themes. Another question that has been coming up is around Énergir, which I understand is the private gas utility, if I'm correct, in Quebec, and their role in all of this, and what is it seen to be? Because presumably, if one is decarbonizing, the role of fossil gas would decline in some way. Do we have any thoughts on that?
So I think so I have to admit that I spend more time looking at the electricity situation in Bill 69, but still Énergir is not forgotten in the bill, in the sense that it gives them, as far as I understand, more latitude to integrate renewable natural gas in their portfolio of projects and give them more possibilities to develop projects and sell it at prices that can actually sustain the renewable natural gas facilities and plants. So the role of Énergir in a way remains the same. Hopefully, through the integrated resource plan, it will be clarified how natural gas will phase out and support meeting the energy needs of Quebec consumers through electricity, but also through increasingly green gases, renewable gases. So and then one key problem is to how to make these renewable gas projects pay for themselves, and it does bring a little bit of additional clarity through Bill 69, sorry.
Thank you. Further thoughts on this? We're good. Thank you. Anders, Hayden.
Yeah, thanks. I want to ask about the growing discussion in Quebec around the concept of sobriété, and I say it in French because I don't think the word has an easy translation in English. I don't think sobriety does it as a translation. Maybe we could say frugality, I think in Europe, the more common translation would be sufficiency, a sense around how much is enough in terms of consumption. And I'm curious, how do we get to the point in Quebec where the Minister of Energy and Economy is telling Quebecers that they're consuming too much and they have to consume less? And how serious is the government about this? I'd be curious to hear some more background on this, and also what the public response has been to this discourse from the government.
Cynthia, go ahead.
Yeah, I can. I mean, without a large scale survey of what people think of these interventions, I mean, Minister Fitzgibbon was kind of known also to come out and say what he thought publicly, which were the particular context into which these remarks were made, a little bit off the cuff. Quebecers should just start their dishwasher in the middle of the night, or Quebecers will just need to learn to use less energy if we were to achieve the energy transition. But as I said, and I appreciate the point about how this could be a faux ami, sobriety. Thank you for pointing that out. I think there's a rising cynicism, and that's the best way I can probably put it at the moment. People are seeing this government hand out massive blocks of energy, which we haven't built in the system at the moment. The capacity is not quite there yet for these promises we're making going forward. And at the same time, we're talking about how Quebecers should retrofit their houses, which from an environmental perspective, that makes sense. We're essentially heating our homes with massive toasters at this point. But so these retrofittings are necessary, and we should have more efficient appliances, and we should change our behaviors massively. And this is why I started this presentation with this point, because this massive buy-in from the population will be necessary. And there's a little bit of arrogance in the way the government is going about rolling out an energy transition plan. And a point that could be added to this intervention is transparency. Quebecois and Québécoises want to know where the electricity is going, who's benefiting from it, and what their personal implication or their personal efforts is contributing to. And that conversation needs to happen, and we should have open books about these things, or an open conversations, rather than just being told what to do. I think that was a hard pill to swallow. That's what I'm hearing, or that's the impression I get from having attended. And I have to caveat this by saying I've been mostly attending citizen meetings around wind development, so particularly situated in communities that are going to see their environments particularly being involved or enrolled in this energy transition to finance private industries, most of which are not Quebecois industry. The recent news cycle around Les Forges de Sorel also is contributing. It could be anecdotal and not quite the large representative of what's happening around the province, but we Quebecers want to know if it's Quebecois industries that will benefit. Will it benefit the local economy here? Will it really benefit an energy transition? And this comments must be caveated by the context in which I'm sitting here in Trois-Rivières, right next to Shawinigan. We also have the Test Canada project we're waiting for a BAP on this project, which is a wind and solar to green hydrogen to natural gas project. And so I think the population is starting to see the fault lines in that and asking, is this carbon focus really making sense? Or is this actually making sense from an energy efficiency perspective?
Maybe I'll add something, is that if we really want to reduce our energy consumption, because the whole point is ultimately to reduce our consumption, we need to have also an honest conversation on prices. And as I mentioned in my presentation, we have extremely low electricity prices in Quebec. That is not a good environment for reducing consumption and investing in energy efficiency. But it's a very hard topic. It's people are extremely sensitive to the price, and whenever they hear, oh, there could be a price increase in electricity, then it becomes political, and all politicians are saying, no, we'll protect you, we don't do that. And it's a really bad start to to remove the price signal from the, it's not the only thing. The price signal is far from being the only signal that we should provide people for better managing and consuming energy, but it's part of the signals they receive. And we don't have the social maturity to have this open conversation. There's there are cross subsidies in Quebec on electricity tariffs. Residential consumers pay less than the cost of service, and commercial and industrial consumers pay more than the cost of service to cross-subsidize residential consumers. And this is something that could be justified, and I think was justified in the past, but now my personal consumption as a university professor is subsidized by commercial users in Quebec, which doesn't make sense. There's no social justification to subsidize me in my own personal residential consumption. I'm not a low-income household, so there's no social justification, but that is barely mentioned in the public debate in Quebec.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, but the obfuscation around tariffs contributes to this lack of transparency, because it's not clear who pays what, and then it's also every time you ask question about this energy transition projects, we're being told, either be the general population or journalists, we're being told that that's not quite public information. That's not quite public information, and that does not contribute to the social acceptability or the massive buy-in that we need for this transition.
Interesting. And thank you, Anders, for the clarification on sobriety as well. In the cultural crossover isn't quite perfect. A couple of questions for Louis-Nicolas around the role of the notion of these IPPs and these sort of potential for basically business to business type relationships. And so one is about what does adjacent mean? Does this literally mean has to be next door, or could this be a sort of area district energy kind of system for an industrial park or something like that? And then also a question about how much will this help with decarbonizing particularly industrial consumption?
I mean, your guess is as good as mine. There's no definition at this stage of what adjacent means. I mean, there's a dictionary definition for sure, but we don't know yet what exactly the government had in mind when someone drafted those words. I think it gives the idea that they don't want. I think it gives the idea that the government does not want a site to start transporting electricity over 15, 20 kilometers to another industrial consumer. And thus sort of encroaching a bit more on Hydro-Quebec's monopoly. I think that's really what they're trying to get at. Now, what does it mean in the real life? Does it mean that it needs to be that they need to share a common boundary? Is that something like that? We don't know yet. And hopefully at some point, probably by regulation, we will get more details on what that means. Because right now, I mean, they're creating this whole new possibility of corporate PPAs, as I call them, of the possibility of selling electricity between two private partners, but we don't have any details on it other than these 20 words that they've introduced in the bill. So hopefully we'll get more details. So there's no, at this stage, I can't answer.
And at this stage, we don't know if there would be restrictions on the generation. Could this be gas fired, or does this need to be renewables? Or we don't know at this stage.
We do know that it's limited to renewables. However,
okay.
The bill does provide that distinction. It needs to come from renewable sources, and it remains in all cases subject to the government's approval. So any arrangement of that nature will need to go back on the minister's desk. I guess we don't know exactly how it's going to be structured. So the government will still maintain some oversight on what happens there.
And this is in a context where in Quebec, there are really no local distribution utilities in the same sense that we have in Ontario. So there's no other intermediary.
There are some minor
Hydro-Quebec runs everything.
Yeah, there are some minor. Go ahead,
yeah. Just there are 10 very tiny and small municipal distributors and one co-op. So 9 municipal distributors and one co-op, but they're very tiny, and they don't represent much.
No, exactly.
A question that's come up in the chat a lot, and of course will be the one that those outside of Quebec wonder about, is the implications of all of this for interprovincial trade in electricity. Because at least in the case of Ontario, almost all of the projections I've seen, including those from the government itself, assume some significant trade interconnections with Quebec and potentially even growth in those interconnections. And I think what you said, Pierre-Olivier, is that that's not where this is potentially going, but wanted to hear from the panel on that in terms of where does this mean Quebec's neighbors need to be adjusting their expectations significantly?
Well, in terms of possible supply contracts from Quebec, long-term supply contracts, I think there's no, it will be impossible for the short term and then probably forever to have long-term supply contract like the two that have been signed with New York and Massachusetts that have been were relatively recently signed, and for which some new transmission lines are being built to New York and to through Maine to supply Massachusetts. I think trade itself, like real-time trade, will of course continue because there is a trading board outside of Quebec that will, look at opportunities, and they will look at opportunities that continue to be there, that will be beneficial for everyone. What I think is lacking now in the current plan is the concept, and not only in Quebec but everywhere, is the idea that as we add more wind and solar everywhere, because everyone is adding wind and solar, if we don't build additional transmission line and if we don't build the trading facilities, we will have surpluses of wind and solar during some hours that will be lost in some places and some shortages. And that these interties between provinces and states are key. And then governments don't understand so far, and utilities, I think, don't understand at this point the value of these transmission lines. There is no long-term planning on these, and there's definitely no project that are planned for, well, no specific projects in the box for Hydro-Québec to see how they could optimize some potential additional wind in Nova Scotia. For example, Nova Scotia is planning a lot of offshore wind, but neither is Nova Scotia planning for transmission lines to export their surpluses when they'll have surpluses, and they'll have to. Of course, whenever you build a wind farm, you have hours of surpluses. And over the long term, all the models are showing that these transmission lines are valuable for everyone to some extent, but to a much higher extent that the current transmission network is possibly offering.
So the relationships may become much more transactional and less sort of firm supply type arrangements as we've seen in the past, and much more dynamic in terms of you've got lots of wind today, we don't, sort of situations, but then still requires build out in terms of interconnection capacity.
Yeah.
Another question, I don't see anything more from the floor, so I'm going to the chat. Another question that has arisen, I saw, is, and this one's also very relevant in Ontario, is questions about risks of overbuild. We're making assumptions about demand, at least as I understand it, mostly in Quebec, it's assumptions about industrial demand, because heating is largely electrified already, which would be the other big one. How should I put it? How is there a plan to manage that risk in some way that these industrial customers or consumption doesn't actually happen? And particularly as we're watching what's happening in the battery sector, for example, there's clearly a pullback going on. So is there an overbuild risk, and then is there a plan to manage that risk in some way?
So I think, well, the short answer is yes, there is an overbuilt risk, and no, there's no plan to manage. Or yes, there is a plan. The plan is basically to socialize the investment cost to everyone. So So the risk is fully borne by Hydro-Québec and its shareholders and customers. And we hope that there'll be some buyers. And what the argument Hydro-Québec is making is that, well, rates are so low right now, there is a room for increase because we basically have cheap electricity. So there's room for increase, and these buyers will, well, the consumers will not really go away because they will have no other choice. So that's how the situation is so far at this point.
So this does sound a little like the supply planning models from the 1970s, potentially. Is
Yes.
build it and they will come.
The challenge is that, you know, we're building at 11, 12, 13 cents per kilowatt hour, but the industrial price is around 5. Maybe it will jump to 6. But so it doesn't make any business sense, you know, build at 12 and sell at 6. Nobody would do that except utilities. And then to the extent that, you know, people agree to pay the 6 cents when they could pay less for energy because, you know, without these additional bills, then the price would stay lower. Then if people agree to pay more to subsidize some industries, then it will work. But as Cynthia mentioned, you know, it's a fuzzy area, and people we may not have the buy-in because we don't really understand the business plan and we don't understand the subsidies, and cynicism may rise, and there might be problems with actually achieving the transition, because if there's not a large, as Cynthia mentioned, an on board of everyone, then things may not run smoothly.
Interesting. Similar questions for Ontario and other jurisdictions. I fear the clock is starting to become our enemy here. But there have been a couple of questions too related to transportation. And in particular, around electrification of transportation and sort of focus on electric vehicles versus trams and trains and those kinds of things. Like, is there a transportation component to all of this, and does it think about in English say modal share, moving people out of cars towards what might be more efficient versions of transportation, even if we're talking about electric vehicles. They're not perfect, and they also, individual vehicles also carry all kinds of other problems too. If anyone wants to take that one.
I have lots to say, but I want to leave Cynthia and Louis-Nicolas some room. So,
well, I would say that there are no ambitious plan for collective transport at this point. I think our electromobility plan is entirely based on single electric vehicle ownership. And in my own opinion, it's a plan that's lacking ambition grossly. But I would pass it back to Pierre-Olivier.
So yes, there's no, I mean, transportation is of course a big, it's the most, the highest emitting sector in terms of greenhouse gases. So it should be the center of our decarbonization policy to improve mobility. But so far the key, well, there's a problem because the key policy, there is a sustainable mobility policy in Quebec, which is actually very good. It's just not implemented. So the government is not implementing its own very good sustainable mobility policy, and it's just pushing for EVs. So what is actually being implemented is an EV policy for all, or that's the ambition, which of course no one in transportation says that's the right way to do, because sustainable mobility doesn't mean EV for all. It means more public transit, more active transportation at lower cost and better health impacts, etc. So we do have the policy, we don't implement the mobility policy. In terms of electricity, it has some implication, especially in terms of peak demand, not so much the energy component. You know, EVs are so efficient that there would be some additional energy needs, but not very important. It's actually the risk of having peak demands during, you know, charging time at around dinner time at 6, 7 p.m. During the winter when it's very cold and everyone goes to supper. And if we do charge at the same time, we need rates to basically discourage people to charge their EV at that time. There are in the bill 69, and we haven't mentioned that, there is something to actually have rates that discourage people from using during peak hours. So that has to be deployed. But because rates are so sensitive in Quebec, as in everywhere, in every province, you know, there is no plan to make these rate options mandatory. It would be like only if you want it, you will have the rate that encourages you not to charge during these hours.
Thank you. Last question I'll give to Keith Brooks, and then I think we need to wrap.
Thanks for all of this. This has been a really sobering conversation because from the outside perspective, I had the sense that Quebec kind of had it together and knew what you were doing, and that there was lessons we should learn from Ontario. But you know, I hear a lot about cynicism and social acceptability, and I just would love to hear your thoughts on what the Quebec government and or Hydro-Quebec could do to improve social acceptability and get better buy-in, since that seems to be key not only in Quebec but here in Ontario and of course across the country.
Well,
I think, yeah,
No,
go
go
ahead,
ahead, go
Gary.
ahead.
I'll complete. No, go ahead.
So I put a lot of, I think the integrated resource plan should be a good occasion to have the public debate, to give options and to tell Quebecers, look, this is what we could do, or this is what another option. So I think in terms of public acceptability, if we have transparency in the options and choices and tell the population, either we do a lot of this or we do a lot of that and we pay this or we pay that, then people will understand that we need to change, but then they need to see the options that they need to see the choice. So hopefully the integrated resource plan will help elevate the debates and make all the projects more acceptable because they see the big picture, which very few people see right now.
Cynthia?
I would agree with that at the high level. At the local level, I'm of two minds, and I think that the problem at the moment is that social acceptability isn't clearly defined. It has no indicators. It's not clearly operationalized, and it's often left in the hands of developers and local governments to manage. And so, what is social acceptability? When do you have social acceptability? And so, the communities are also tired, and then these questions are asked directly. I've been in town halls where people are like, when will you determine if you have social acceptability or not? We've been coming here every Tuesday for the past 6 months, and so people are tired of like having to maintain this opposition when their perspective is in opposition. So the lack of clear indicators and targets on this front is a problem. At the same time, the flip side is that once we do define indicators on social acceptability, then you have the possibility of saying, well, I held 3 town halls. There were 300 people who came. We held 6 hours of conversation. I did my due diligence. And so it becomes a rubber stamping mechanism. And that's the questions that we're having. It's the conundrum around social acceptability that at this particular moment for these projects. One more thing to add on that, we're seeing, it's recent, but in BC recently, there was social acceptability on a project 10 years ago, and now there is not anymore. The building time for capacity in those projects sometimes will open the door for the target is moving. And so how do we account for that? So it's I don't have a clear answer for you, but these are things to keep in mind.
Louis-Nicolas, any thoughts on this?
No, nothing to add further to my 2 distinguished colleagues. I think they very, very good answers.
That could be a whole other conversation, which we'll have to have, because of course there's quite a bit, of course, from in Ontario, I think we did almost everything wrong in some ways, but hopefully there might be some learnings from there. I think we're slightly over time. This has been a fascinating and incredibly informative conversation. And I'd like to ask everybody to join me in thanking Pierre-Olivier, Cynthia, and Louis-Nicolas for their remarks and their responses to the questions. This has just been great. Thanks to Joanne Whitmore also for her help in organizing this, and to JJ Strantz for helping us out with the administrative details in the background and the chat and everything. So we've got the recording. We will have to do a little processing and then get it posted onto our YouTube channel, and then there'll be links that at HSA as well. So again, thank you all. Merci beaucoup. C'est très bien, formidable. And hopefully we will see some of you in other capacities at some point in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.